In this lecture, you're going to learn about Photoshop's hotkeys and how they make your workflow faster. So what is a hotkey? A hotkey is a key on your keyboard that you can press to bring up a tool or a window in Photoshop's interface very quickly. So the first hotkey we're going to go over is the hotkey for the grab and move tool. So the hotkey for this tool is going to be the letter V. So you'll see right now I'm on my zoom tool. If I go ahead and hit the letter V on my keyboard, undo hotkey. So rather than every time coming up to edit and then hitting undo move, it's much quicker to use the hotkey to undo it. So on a Windows, it's going to be Control Z, and on a Mac, it's going to be Command Z. Now, if you're on a Windows and you want to undo multiple moves, you're going to have to hit Control Alt Z to continue undoing your moves. Next, let's go over the hotkey for the marquee tool. So the hotkey for the marquee tool is going to be the letter M on your keyboard, and now we can go ahead and use that tool. Then if we hit the letter V, switching over to our grab and move tool, we can go ahead and grab and move that. So you'll see how much quicker it is now to get things done, because you don't have to constantly be moving across the screen to grab different tools and windows and settings. The next one we're going to go over is the lasso tool. That's going to be the letter L on our keyboard, so we'll hit that, and now we can go ahead and draw our selection like so. Next, we're going to go over the eyedropper tool. So the hotkey for that is going to be the letter I. And now we can go ahead and select whatever colors we like. The next tool we'll go over is the brush tool, which is going to be the letter B. And now we can go ahead and paint. Now I also want you to notice that I can't paint outside of this selection. This is a very important tool and aspect of Photoshop, is that you can make selections like this, and it'll only affect the inside of that selection. The next tool we're going to go over is the erase tool. So we're going to hit the letter E on our keyboard, and now we can go ahead and erase. Now you'll notice that it's yellow. The reason for that is because my background color is set to yellow, and I have my document set up so that there's no transparent background, but it uses this background color as its background. Next, let's go over the gradient and fill tool. So that's going to be the letter G on our keyboard. And now we can go ahead and fill our selection in with a gradient. Next, let's go over the zoom tool, which is going to be the letter Z on our keyboard. So we can go ahead and hit that. And now we can zoom in and out. Next, let's go over the hotkeys for our brush settings. So if we switch over to our brush, it can get really annoying and be a big hassle if every time you want to change your brush and size and opacity, you have to come up here to your brush panel and change it. So a really quick way to change your size and opacity is by hitting the square brackets on your keyboard. So if we hit the square bracket on the right side, that's going to increase the size of our brush. If we hit the one on the left side, that's going to decrease the size of our brush. Then also, if you want to change the opacity of your brush, so right now I have mine set to 0, but if I wanted that to be more transparent, meaning that it's more see-through, I can hit one of the numbers on my keyboard. So if I hit the number 5 on my keyboard, that's going to take my brush down to 50% opacity. So now if I paint, that's only at 50% opacity. If I hit the 2 on my keyboard, that's going to put it at 20% opacity, and now you see that's even lighter. So as you can see, hotkeys in Photoshop can make your workflow way faster, and I highly recommend that you go through this lecture a couple of times and really get familiar with the hotkeys. Your assignment for this lecture is to memorize all the hotkeys and practice them. Create your own little projects. They don't even have to be actual drawings or images. They can just be scribbles and doodles, but practice switching between the different hotkeys so that you can make your workflow faster. Thanks for watching this lecture, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one. In this lecture, you're going to learn about how Photoshop layers work and how they can help you to create amazing artwork. So the first thing we're going to go over is the layers panel. So over here in the bottom right corner of your screen, you have this area, and it's called the layers panel. Now what you can do here is you can add multiple layers. So right now we have one layer. It's called the background layer, and it's a locked layer. That means we can't really do anything to it except for paint on it. Now we can go ahead and add a new layer above that by hitting this little icon down here that looks like a piece of paper with a folded corner. So let's go ahead and hit that, and now you see that adds a new layer above that. Now, many people get confused with layers in Photoshop, so I want to break this down so it makes more sense to you if you are confused. So each layer has to be thought of as a piece of glass in a stack. So right now we have our background layer, which is a piece of glass, but it's completely painted on. There's no transparent areas. Then our next layer is another sheet of glass on top of that, but there's nothing painted on top of it. But what we can do now is if we switch over to our brush tool, and let's select a color that we can see really well, like a red. Now we can paint on this layer because we have it selected in our layers panel. I'm going to turn my opacity up, but now you can see we're able to paint on this layer. And it may look like we've painted on our background, but we haven't because that's on a separate layer. And we can turn this layer off by coming over here to our layer palette and hitting this eye icon, and that'll turn that layer off. And now you can see that our background layer is completely unaffected by that layer because they're separate layers. This is the amazing thing about Photoshop, is that you're able to do this with layers. And you can add as many layers as you like. So if we turn this layer back on, let's add a new layer above that, and let's switch over to the color green. Now I'm going to go ahead and paint on top of this. And you'll see if I turn this layer off, my other two layers are completely unaffected. Now this doesn't mean that layers can't interact with each other, it just means that they don't affect each other permanently. So what we can do now is we can change the blend modes on our layers. And what this means is it just changes the way our layers interact. So up here on this little menu that says normal, we're going to go ahead and hit that drop down arrow. And now you see we get all these different options. So if we switch over to something like multiply, you see that completely affects the way that our layer interacts with our other two layers. Let's change that to a different layer blend mode. So let's change it to overlay, and that also changes the way it interacts. So layer blend modes are a very important thing, and they allow us to create different interactions between our layers. Now you can also create a folder in your layers panel, and what this means is it means you can group layers together to keep it organized. So if we come over here to our layers palette and we hold down shift to select our other layer, that allows us to select multiple layers at the same time. Then we can come down here to this icon that looks like a folder and click that, and now both those layers are within this folder. You can see here if we hit that drop down arrow, you can see them both in there. Now let's go ahead and undo that. I want to show you how you can use a hotkey to do that even quicker. So if we hit Control G on our keyboard, that'll automatically put those into a folder. If you're on a Mac, you're going to hit Command G. Now, what if you want to make a copy of a layer? Well, what you can do is you can click your layer, then you can hit Control J or Command J if you're on a Mac, and now you just saw that made a copy of our layer. So now we have two of these. If I use my grab and move tool, I can move that out of the way and you can see both of them. Now, when you're working with layers in Photoshop, once you start getting more than probably about 8 layers, it's going to get really confusing because the only thing you have to identify your layer in your layers palette is this little thumbnail. So what we want to do to keep organized is label our layers. So for example, we can double click where it says layer 1, and now we can type whatever we want into that layer label. So let's call this red because there's a red squiggle on it. And we can do the same thing for our green. So we'll double click, I'll type in green, and then the next one I'm going to type in green 2. So now I know what's on each one of those. Then I can also label my folder, and we'll call this folder 1. And so now I have an idea of what's on each one of these layers. This is super useful to stay organized. So remember to always label your layers and folders while you're working in Photoshop. That brings us to the end of this lecture. So in this lecture, you learned how to use layers in Photoshop and how they interact with each other. You learned how layers don't permanently affect other layers, and you also learned how you can make them interact with each other by using the blend modes. Then you learned the hotkeys to create folders and copies of your layers, and then you learned how to label those folders and layers so that you can stay organized. Thanks for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in the next lecture.